Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at meaning holism.
Oh, cool.
And just the idea that all the meanings of the words in a language are all interconnected.
Okay, yeah.
It's kind of like I think like a spider web,
Uh-huh.
where you touch one part and the whole thing vibrates.
Like it's all connected.
Yeah, so that's the basic idea. And so we're going to be looking at this in terms of meaning holism.
Right.
And so that means you can't understand any single word
Mhm.
without understanding all of the words.
Right.
And so that is in contrast to meaning atomism, where like each word has its own independent meaning.
Yeah.
And then also molecularism, where each word is connected to just a small subset of other words.
Right, like a molecule.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, you're someone who likes to learn things fast, but also you want to learn things well.
I do, yeah.
And I think this is a good topic for that. You can really dive deep into like a specific area of philosophy
Right.
without having to know a lot of other stuff. So
Absolutely. Yeah, this is really a contained thing.
yeah, so we're going to be looking at the arguments for and against.
Okay.
Meaning holism,
Oh, cool.
drawing on like the work of some of the most influential thinkers in this area.
Right. Yeah.
So, you may be coming at this with a variety of levels of knowledge
Right.
of this particular topic, but our goal is to make it as clear as possible.
Yes.
So you can just jump right in.
Yeah, avoid all the jargon.
Yeah, and I think this is actually not just some new idea that somebody came up with like a couple of years ago.
Uh-huh.
It's actually got deep roots in the history of philosophy, going back to at least Quine,
Oh, yeah, definitely.
who argued that when we test our ideas about the world, it's not just some individual statement that's up for grabs, but actually the whole system of our beliefs.
Yes. Yeah.
And even before that, you've got Hempel,
Okay.
who argued that the meaning of a statement in empirical language is not like self-contained,
Yeah.
but is actually determined by its logical relationships to all the other statements in the language.
Yeah, there's like a lot of interdependence in meaning.
Yeah, so that's just some background, and let's jump into the arguments for meaning holism.
Okay.
Now, the direct arguments for meaning holism start by giving us a definition of meaning.
Right.
And then they say, okay, if this definition is correct, then that means meaning holism has to be true.
Yeah, like it follows from the definition. Like if a network is defined as connected, then everything has to be connected by definition.
Yeah, so that's how the arguments go. And one area where this happens is with theories that equate meaning with use.
Mm-hmm.
So one is verificationism,
Okay.
where the meaning of a sentence is its method of verification.
Right.
So if you combine that with the idea of the holism of confirmation,
Okay.
which is that we can't confirm any one statement without looking at a whole network of beliefs and observations, then it seems like the meaning of a sentence is tied up with the meanings of all the sentences that are related to it.
Right.
And Hempel and Quine both argue that this means that meaning is holistic.
Yeah, that's the way it goes.
Yeah.
If verification is holistic
Uh-huh.
and meaning is verification, then meaning is holistic.
Yeah, so it's kind of like if I were to say there's a dog barking outside.
Mm-hmm.
I can't verify that without knowing what a dog is.
Right.
Barking is what outside is.
Right.
All these concepts are related to each other.
Yeah, and also I guess like you need to know like what counts as a dog. Like what's the difference between a dog and a wolf?
Yeah.
And maybe you need to know something about like the acoustics of barking, like how far a bark can travel and stuff like that.
Yeah, so that's just one. And then we also have inferential role semantics.
Okay.
And this is the idea that the meaning of a word is determined by the inferences it's involved in.
Right. So the conclusions we draw from it.
Yeah, like if this, then that.
Yeah. And also, I guess, what conclusions it follows from. So, like, if this is true, then this must also be true.
Yeah. And so the idea is that to accept those inferences, you have to rely on other words. So, like, it's the meanings of all the words are connected to each other.
Right. So, like, to know what bachelor means, you have to know what unmarried means and man.
Yeah.
And maybe also things like eligible or available.
Yeah.
These are all connected in some way.
Yeah. And so philosophers like Bloch,
Okay. Yep.
Random Harmon, and Sellers
Yep.
all argued for this view.
Right.
And also, this view also tends to reject the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths.
Right. So the idea that some things are true by definition and other things are true based on facts about the world.
Yeah. So like an analytic truth would be like all bachelors are unmarried.
Right.
And a synthetic truth would be like it's raining outside.
Right.
Yeah.
So like for the inferential role semanticist, there's no real distinction there.
Yeah, because it's like, well, if you understand the word,
Yeah.
then you understand those inferences.
Right.
So there's...
It's not like you look at the world to see if it's true.
Yeah.
You just know it based on meaning.
Yeah, so it's kind of like if you understand the word triangle,
Okay.
then you also understand that it has 3 sides.
Yeah, you don't have to go out and like count the sides of every triangle.
Yeah, and that seems like an analytic truth.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you take another word like squirrel,
Okay.
and you say, well, squirrels live in trees, that seems like a synthetic truth because you could imagine a squirrel living in a house.
Right, you can imagine a squirrel living in a car.
Yeah, but if meaning is all about these inferential roles, then where do you draw the line?
Yeah, where do you draw the line?
Between those 2 types of truths.
Right, it seems like it's all going to be analytic.
Yeah, so this is where the rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction becomes important.
Right.
Yeah. And then we also have functional property theories.
Okay.
Which say that meaning is a functional property of a person.
Okay.
And functional properties are individuated holistically.
So that means that the meaning of a word is tied to its role in a larger system, like the role of a neuron in the brain.
Yeah.
You can't really understand it without understanding its connections to all the other neurons.
Yeah, and so Bloch and Churchland both defended this view.
Okay, cool.
And then the last one is belief-based theories.
Okay.
Which say that the meaning of a word for someone is constituted by all of their beliefs that are expressed using that word.
Oh, okay.
So this is Bill Gromy's view.
Right.
And so, for example, if I believe that coffee is bitter and coffee wakes me up and coffee beans are grown in South America, then that is what I mean by coffee.
Right.
But if you believe that coffee is sweet and coffee makes you sleepy, then you mean something different by coffee.
Right, because our beliefs are different.
Yeah, and so this illustrates how meaning holism follows from these views.
Yeah.
Because if the meaning of coffee is tied to all these beliefs and inferences,
right,
then a change in those beliefs is a change in meaning.
Right? So, like, if you used to believe that coffee is bitter, but now you believe it's sweet, then you're not just changing your mind about coffee, you're actually changing the meaning of the word coffee for you.
Yeah, and remember the example of squirrel being connected to animal and koala.
Right.
And so, like, if you change your beliefs about squirrels, then that could affect the meaning of all the other words.
Right. It ripples out.
Yeah. So that's the basic idea. And so you might ask, well, why do people believe these things?
Right.
And one reason is that they think that it's needed for psychological explanation.
Okay.
So, like, if you have 2 different expressions that refer to the same thing.
Yeah, like morning star and evening star. They both refer to Venus.
Yeah, but they seem to have different cognitive significance.
Right.
And holism can explain that.
Right. Because they're connected to different beliefs.
Yeah. And also, it just seems like our understanding of concepts is holistic. Like when you think of a dog, you're not just thinking of like the dictionary definition of a dog.
Right.
You're thinking of all the things that you associate with dogs.
Yeah, like barking and fetching and wagging their tails.
Yeah. And so philosophers like Bill Grommy, Brandon Heel, and Bloch have all argued that these considerations support holism.
Right.
And so the general form of the argument is like this. Some inferential properties must be part of meaning.
Okay.
And if some are, then all are.
Okay.
So therefore, all inferential properties are part of meaning.
Right. So that's the argument for holism.
Yeah. And so, you know, the atomists, they reject the first premise. They say no inferential properties are part of meaning.
Okay.
And the molecularists reject the second premise.
Okay.
They say that only some inferential properties are part of meaning. Yeah, so let's move on to the indirect arguments.
Okay.
Now, indirect arguments don't try to give a definition of meaning. Instead, they try to support holism by arguing against the other views, say atomism and molecularism.
Right.
So let's start with a critique of molecularism.
Okay.
Now, molecularism says that meaning is determined by only some inferences.
Right.
But the problem is that it's hard to draw a line between meaning constitutive and non-meaning constitutive inferences.
Yeah, like which inferences are part of the meaning and which ones aren't.
Yeah, and if you try to draw that line, you're going to rely on the analytic-synthetic distinction,
right,
which is something that Quine rejected.
Yeah.
So this is the argument that molecularism is just an unstable middle ground between atomism and holism.
Right. You're either all in or all out.
Yeah. And Fodor and Lepore argued for this view.
Okay.
Although Divot did argue against it.
Okay, so there's this disagreement there.
Yeah. And there have been attempts to defend molecularism without relying on the analytic-synthetic distinction.
Okay.
But they're all pretty controversial.
Yeah.
And people like Bogosian,
Divot,
Porridge,
okay,
Patchery,
okay,
Peacock, and Russell have all worked on this.
Right.
But yeah, it's still a very controversial area.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the critique of atomism.
Okay.
Now, atomistic theories tend to be causal theories.
Right.
And they come in two flavors.
Okay.
Backward-looking and forward-looking.
Okay.
So let's start with backward-looking causal theories.
Okay.
These are theories that say that the meaning of a word is determined by its causal history.
Right, so like where it came from.
Yeah, so like when it was first used and who used it and what they were referring to.
Yeah.
And so this is inspired by the work of Kripke and Putnam.
Okay.
And so the idea is like the meaning of cat is tied to those original instances when somebody pointed at a cat and said cat.
Right.
And so this seems like a good way to have atomistic meanings.
Yeah.
Because each word has its own unique causal history.
Right.
But there are problems with this view.
Okay.
So, for example, there's the Madagascar case, which was pointed out by Evans.
Okay.
And so the idea is that Madagascar was originally thought to be part of the African mainland.
Right.
But it's actually an island.
Right.
And so if the meaning of Madagascar is tied to that original act of naming, then it seems like we're still referring to the wrong place.
Right.
Because the causal chain goes back to a mistake.
Yeah.
But we're not. We're actually referring to the island.
Yeah.
And so that's a problem for backward-looking causal theories.
Okay.
And also there's the problem that even to understand that initial act of naming, you need to have some background beliefs.
Right.
It's like if I pointed at a cat and say cat,
you
need to understand that I'm talking about a kind of animal.
Right.
Not just this particular individual.
Yeah, not just a patch of fur.
Yeah, or like a movement or something like that.
You need to know that it's a category.
Yeah, and so this is called a sortal belief.
Okay.
And so this is a problem for atomism because it means that even to get started,
you need to have a whole bunch of beliefs.
Yeah, a whole background of beliefs.
Yeah, and so that's pushing you towards holism. Right. Okay. So now let's talk about forward-looking causal theories.
Okay.
So these theories say that meaning is determined by how we use words in the future.
Oh.
So like if I see a cat and I say cat, then that's part of what I mean by cat.
Right.
And so this is associated with information semantics and philosophers like Dritsk, Fodor, and Stampe.
Okay.
But the problem with this view is the disjunction problem,
Okay.
which is how do you know if I'm using the word correctly or if I'm making a mistake?
Yeah, like what if you saw a fox and said cat?
Yeah, so like if I see a dog and I say cat, does that mean that cat now includes dogs in its meaning?
Yeah.
And so there have been attempts to solve this problem,
Okay.
like saying that you have to be in optimal conditions to know the meaning of a word.
Or that the context in which you learn the word is important.
Okay.
Or that there's an asymmetry in the causal dependence. But none of these solutions are widely accepted.
Yeah.
And also, Bogosian has argued that even to get the truth conditions right for individual words, you need to appeal to the speaker's beliefs.
Right.
So this is another way in which these theories are being pushed towards holism.
Yeah, it seems like everything's pushing towards holism.
Yeah. And the last point I want to make about these causal theories is that they tend to focus on words like cat and red, which are like concrete nouns and adjectives.
Yeah.
But they don't really have anything to say about words like big and of and quickly and unless, which don't seem to have the same kind of connection to the world.
Yeah, like how do you point to unless?
Yeah. And so holism has an advantage here because it can give a unified account of how all different kinds of words get their meaning.
Right.
So to sum up the arguments against atomism and molecularism showed that the determinants of meaning are interconnected.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that meaning itself is holistic.
Right.
To get to that conclusion, you need the additional assumption that the function from determinants of meaning to meaning is one-to-one.
Right.
So that any change in the determinants results in a change in meaning.
Right. So like if you change your beliefs about squirrels, then you change the meaning of squirrel.
Yeah, and that's a controversial assumption.
Yeah.
So that's the end of the arguments for holism.
Okay.
Now let's move on to the problems for holism.
All right.
So the first problem is compositionality.
Okay.
And compositionality is the principle that the meaning of a complex expression is determined by the meanings of its parts.
Right. So like the meaning of pet fish is a combination of the meanings of pet and fish.
Yeah. And so the problem for holism is that the inferences we draw from complex expression don't always seem to follow from the inferences we draw from its parts.
Right.
So, for example, we can infer weighs less than 3 ounces from that's a pet fish.
Yeah.
But that inference doesn't seem to come from the meaning of pet or fish.
Right.
And so Fodor and Lepore argued that this is a problem for holism.
Yeah, because if meaning is holistic, then how can you compose meanings?
Yeah, and so Bloch responded to this by saying that if we include conditional inferences, like weighs less than 3 ounces if it's a fish in the meaning of pet, then we can get compositionality.
Okay.
But Brandom says that even if holism isn't strictly compositional, it can still be recursive, which means that the meanings at one level are determined by the meanings at a lower level.
Right.
And he thinks that that's enough to explain how we learn and use language. But Stanley argues that atomistic truth-conditional semantics has been more successful in providing semantic analyses of natural language than holistic approaches.
Okay, so there's like a practical problem there.
Yeah, so that's the compositionality problem.
Okay.
Now let's move on to the instability problem.
All right.
Now the instability problem is that if meaning is determined by all of our beliefs, then any change in our beliefs is a change in meaning.
Right. So, like, if I change my mind about something, then I'm also changing the meanings of the words I'm using.
Yeah. And if two people have different beliefs, then they mean different things by the same words.
Right.
And this seems to blur the distinction between changes in meaning and changes in belief.
Right. Because they're the same thing.
Yeah. And so this has a lot of weird consequences.
Okay.
So, for example, it means that you can't really change your mind.
Yeah, because if you change your mind, then you're changing the meanings of the words.
Yeah, so you're not really changing your mind about the same thing.
Right. It's like a different proposition.
Yeah. And also, you can't really disagree with someone.
Yeah. Because if you disagree, then you must mean different things.
Yeah, so you're not really disagreeing.
Right. It's just talking past each other.
Yeah. And also, it's hard to see how you could learn a language. Because you would need to know all the beliefs of the speakers before you could understand any of the words.
Yeah, it seems impossible.
Yeah, and communication also seems impossible.
Yeah, because you would need to have the same beliefs to understand each other.
Yeah, and psychological explanation, which relies on the idea that people can have the same beliefs, also seems impossible.
Right.
And so this is all pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Because it seems like we can change our minds and disagree with people and learn languages and communicate with each other.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like our meanings are constantly changing.
Yeah, so this is the incredulous stare objection.
Right.
It's just like, really?
Yeah, it just seems wrong.
Yeah, so how do Hellists respond to this?
Okay.
Well, some of them just bite the bullet and say that our intuitions are wrong.
Right.
But most of them try to find ways to mitigate the instability.
Okay.
So one way is to appeal to similarity. So they say that even if our beliefs aren't exactly the same, they're similar enough to allow for communication and understanding.
Okay.
But the problem with this is that it seems to presuppose shared meaning.
Yeah, like how do you know if our beliefs are similar unless you already know what the words mean?
Yeah, so it's kind of circular.
Right.
Another way to respond is to distinguish between narrow and wide content.
Okay.
So narrow content is the holistic meaning, and wide content is the atomistic meaning.
Okay.
And so you could say that we communicate using wide content, even if our narrow content is different. But this raises questions about how the two types of content are related, and whether this really saves holism.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we have contextualism, which says that only some beliefs are relevant in a given context.
Right. So like if we're talking about the weather, then we don't need to know all of our beliefs about the universe.
Yeah, just the ones that are relevant to the weather.
Right.
And then there's anti-individualism, which says that meaning is determined by the beliefs of a group.
Right. So it's not just individualistic.
Yeah. And then there's normativity,
okay,
which says that meaning is determined by the inferences we should make, not the ones we actually make.
Right.
So all of these are attempts to deal with the instability problem.
Yeah.
And they all have their own strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
Okay, so the last problem for holism is analyticity.
Okay.
And the problem is that if meaning is determined by our beliefs, then it seems like all of our beliefs are true by definition.
Right, because they're part of the meaning.
Yeah, and so this is a problem for objectivity.
Yeah, because it means we can't really be wrong about anything.
Yeah, so for example, if my belief that all swans are white is part of what I mean by swan, then if I see a black swan, I might just change my meaning of swan instead of admitting that I was wrong.
Yeah, that's not good.
Yeah, so how do holists respond to this?
Okay.
Well, again, they use some of the same strategies.
Right.
So they appeal to the narrow-wide content distinction. They say that contextualism can help. Yeah. They appeal to anti-individualism.
Right.
And they say that normativity can help.
Okay.
But none of these solutions are perfect.
Right.
And so the debate continues.
Yeah.
So to sum up meaning, holism is a view that says that the meanings of all the words in a language are interconnected.
Right.
And there are a lot of arguments for and against this view, but there's no clear consensus.
Right.
And so it's up to you to decide what you think.
Yeah.
So as you go about your day, think about how you understand words and whether you think that they're connected to each other.
Right.
Or whether they have their own independent meanings.
Yes.
And if you're interested in learning more about this topic, then I recommend checking out the work of the philosophers we've discussed.
Right.
Like Quine Hempel, Brandom,
okay,
Fodor, and all the others.
Cool.
So, yeah, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, it was fun.